Katharine Ainger. I'm a freelance journalist, and I'm also I'm an editor, and I also work as a consultant for the research group Corporate Europe Observatory, which is based in Brussels, and they produce a lot of policy briefings for the EU and position papers. So I'm here today to teach you how to do. Oops, is that okay? A policy briefing. Now, that will, within a certain format that is sort of standard for the EU. Now, there should be a sheet going around which is this standard format. I don't know if everyone has a copy. Has everyone got a copy? I don't know if we don't have quite enough, if some people can share, and at the end, we'll make sure that you can have one to take away. Okay, so I want to talk about what makes a brief likely to be read by policymakers. So how do you approach the whole project of writing policy briefs? So what you have to do as somebody who has come from academia is you have to sort of think of yourself as building a cultural bridge. Policymakers are intelligent non-specialists, and so their requirements for a piece of information are not going to be the same as an academic colleague. So for example, if you're spending a lot of time going into your methodology, policymakers aren't actually interested in that. You know, they're interested in your findings, and they're interested in action points, recommendations, very concrete things. So you've got to, the things that make you that make an excellent academic published paper in an academic journal, or make you an excellent researcher, don't necessarily mean that you can write a good briefing. So you need to sort of think about shifting your mentality slightly into a different way of communicating. And so a policy brief is a concise summary of a particular issue, the policy options to deal with it, and some recommendations on the best option. It's aimed at government policymakers and others who are interested in creating and influencing policy. So those are kind of the basic obvious things. But bear in mind where the culture of politicians and civil servants and policymakers comes from. Okay, so they're regularly forced to make decisions in the face of incomplete or contradictory evidence. If they're not using research evidence, they're often making decisions based on ideology or tradition. That's the way it's always been. So you're offering, what you're offering is sort of concrete evidence that they can base their decisions on, and that's of great benefit. So you're offering something, very useful there. But your research can be groundbreaking and important, and still not reach those policymakers if you don't present it in the right way, if you don't manage to communicate the urgency, the importance, the key points about your research. So they're looking for fresh insights and solid data that will possibly shed some light on an aspect of an issue they're dealing with. So I'm just kind of going to keep repeating this point, but so you don't need to reproduce your whole PhD in a policy brief. Okay, that's not what they're looking for. So they want the facts to be well supported, but they're not going to wade through lots and lots and lots of evidence. So a length of policy brief should be not more than 10 pages long, basically. Could be 6, an average is about 8. And you'll find actually, one of the things it's much easier to write long than it is to write short and be concise and get all the points it's interesting because you kind of think, oh, I've written X thousand words, that's good, that gives them more information, but it's actually the opposite. It's much harder to write concisely and well in a short, brief, punchy points than it is to sort of expand on a subject that you know probably more than most people in the world about, because you've just spent however many years researching it or studying it. And just to reiterate, successfully policy briefs emphasize the findings of a study rather than how the findings were derived. So it's all about effective communication. So a policy brief can't be better than the research it's based upon. So you don't want to start making exaggerated claims for your evidence, obviously, or your findings. But a policy briefing can be worse than the evidence that you provide. And what I mean by that is by presenting your results badly, your findings, however good or important, won't necessarily become policy. So a policy brief it's a tool for explaining the significance of your findings. So don't explain all aspects of your research. If you attempt to do that, it will become unreadable. So what you need to do is you need to capture the policymaker's interest. That's what you need to do. And page 1 is the most important page of the policy brief. So what you're doing is you're luring them and saying, this is important, this matters, and this is why. And once you've done that, you can then go into a dialogue about, well, this is how we research things. You know, there's a whole load of following on dialogue you can have once you've grabbed the intention. But the policy briefing and the first page, particularly the policy briefing, is not the place to go into all the sort of background detail. So I like to think of it, one of the things I found, I actually just did a huge amount of research into PR companies that represent repressive regimes. I spent months doing this, and then I had to write a policy paper for recommendations to the European Parliament for how they control lobbying, this kind of lobbying. And I found that having spent months in the research, it was really difficult to just pull out and get to the kind of recommendations because I was kind of lost in the detail. And I sort of think of that of an image of Google Earth. You know, when you're going through the street map and you're exploring things and you're finding out interesting details and you're finding your way. And in order to convey your information to other people, you have to do the zoom button. You have to zoom back out and look at the terrain, look at the whole city, look at the city in the context of the country, look at the country in the context of the continent. I don't know, I just found that a useful way to think of, okay, this is how I have to pull right back and convey the key issues to politicians who are busy and trying to convince them that this stuff's important. But the other thing to say is that you also don't want to take for granted background information, because the other thing is, if I'm, to use that Google Earth image again, if I'm in this street and I've just walked down the last street, I know that the last street is there. But a policymaker is not a specialist in your subject, has not, you know, done all the background research. So you need to leave out some of the things like methodology that a sort of very advanced academic would be interested in your research, but you need to include some of the very basic stuff that's almost too obvious to say. The things that you think are so obvious or common sense, maybe they've never heard of before. So you need to make sure that if there are key concepts your research relies on, that you include those kinds of concepts. Trying to think of a good example. For example, if you refer to carbon markets or carbon trading in passing, they may not have heard of carbon markets or the financialization of nature. So that's a good example in a sort of environmental policy terms. They may not know what that means, but you don't need to go into a huge paragraph about describing all of the aspects of financialization. You just need to say, such as carbon trading, biodiversity offset. You just need to say a couple of concrete examples just to bring them back to, okay, this is what we're talking about, right? I don't know everything about that. I don't need to know everything about that, but I'm not lost here. Am I speaking too fast, by the way? Because I realise I'm a native English speaker and I have a tendency to speed up. So do you want me to slow down a bit?
Just because it's really dense, useful stuff. So
yeah. And just to say, I mean, I am skimming a lot because I'm just conscious of time, but there is a lot of what I'm saying is in this piece of paper as well, not all of it, but you know, so if you feel like you're not writing everything down, don't worry. There's a lot of the useful key things are also in that piece of paper. So, but I also want to give you some. So before we go into the actual format and kind of length and how you structure it and the sort of very technical things, I just want to give a few more tips about framing and planning, because that's the most important stage of any piece of writing. So you can think about who's the audience, who does this matter to. That'll help you form the frame. And every time you get lost, because you will get lost when you're planning it, you come back to who's the audience, who does this matter to? And another way that's very useful to learn how to plan a policy brief is to get another policy brief. For example, there's one here that I think is in the Dropbox for the course, a clicker one about climate change, water conflicts and human security in the Mediterranean, Middle East and Sahel. This is the format that we were using for how to do a policy brief. So that's just one example, but you could find another one. You take a policy brief that exists and deconstruct it. How was it put together? What were the logical points that they put together in order to build their argument? That's a really good way. That's how writers learn to write. They read and they deconstruct how people write, how people put together an argument. So that's a really good practice, and I recommend going away and trying to do that. Obviously, sometimes the most obvious things are the things you forget when you're writing. So make sure the policy relevant issues at the heart of the project are clearly defined and communicated when you're making a plan. And as I've talked a bit about clarity and jargon, I just want to, I'm a bit of a stickler for this issue. So obviously you will inevitably have to use some technical language or some academic type language in your briefing, but try and avoid it as much as possible. If you have to use an acronym, define it. Avoid it if possible. If you have to use an acronym, define it the first time you use it, and try not to use too many. And the thing about jargon is actually designed, I think, is designed to keep a discussion within the realm of experts. And you're trying to communicate outside of your circle to a different circle. And then politicians and civil servants, they have their own jargon, and it's different from academic jargon often, it doesn't overlap. So we need to sort of remove ourselves from that milieu of technical language and aim for succinct. And I believe there are very few, even very complicated or profound or paradigm-shifting ideas that can't be communicated in simple language, which is something George Orwell talks about. And he talks about how jargon can also be used to obfuscate and to make difficult realities sort of abstract, and using euphemism to push away the reality. So I think there's also a political dimension to what language you use. For example, as a campaigning journalist, you often come across terms like collateral damage. It's much easier to accept collateral damage than it is to accept, 100 villagers who've been killed by a drone attack, for example. So when you use concrete, specific examples, you're bringing things back to real-life contexts, and you can't get lost in some kind of abstraction of a policy debate that doesn't actually bring you back to real-life consequences, real-life actions, real-life recommendations. So that's why I'm not just saying don't use jargon because it's confusing. I'm also saying don't use jargon because it makes you, because there's a political dimension to it. There's a communication dimension to it. And there's a human cost to it. And actually it's interesting, there's a study I think that was just published that the people trying to look intelligent use very long sentences and very complicated words. And then what they discovered was the people used speaking like this didn't come across as more intelligent. Other people just thought, oh, they're trying to look intelligent. But the people who really looked intelligent were the people who were able to convey their ideas in a succinct, clear way. And so I like that idea. I think it's quite egalitarian, the idea that most people can understand big ideas if you explain them clearly and well. And this is also from George Orwell, who I think is a very good model for learning to write well and clearly. He also said, he recommends look back. I'm paraphrasing, but he says, look back, ask if you could have said the same thing in less words, and if you can, do. Right, how am I doing for time? Because I should get into the...
You have an hour left.
An hour left, okay. Right, well, I'm going to go, I'm in that case, I'm going to go into a little bit about the difference between an objective brief and an advocacy brief. Now, I don't know what all your research is based on and what issues you're working on. But if you're, but you may be more interested in writing an advocacy type brief than an objective brief. So, for example, an objective brief might be in mountaintop removal, coal mining, or I don't know what I can't remember what it's called, but you know, you might say, well, these are the advantages and these are the disadvantages that the evidence has brought up. And an advocacy brief might say, well, we recommend that the disadvantages are so great that you don't actually pursue this type of coal mining. So that, I don't know if that's clear, the difference. I mean, and some of them will be a kind of hybrid. So it's not that there's, you know, two very different types and you can never combine them, but and I suspect there will be some of you who are interested in doing more of an advocacy type briefing. So what's really useful, and I use this when I'm doing campaigning journalism as well, and people use it when they're also developing NGO campaigns. It's basically, you have to look at what the status quo argument is. Before you construct your argument, I don't know if I should write this down. I don't know if you can even see this, actually. Can you read? So the status quo in this case would be, what does the mining company, what's their position on it? What's the sort of accepted reality of the situation with this mine? Oh, it creates local jobs. It's really important for you know, our trade deficit, whatever those realities are, whatever they use their arguments as. So what is the status quo argument? Now, this sounds incredibly obvious, but when you do it, it actually really helps you construct a counter-argument. So you find out what is the status quo argument, you break it down into each point, and then you argue back. And once you do that, your plan is made. Your plan is made for how you write your policy brief. Does that make sense? It's kind of a reverse engineering of a plan. So, and now, once you've done that, that's not it. You know that you also need to be looking at, you know, what evidence you're providing. It has to be based on the evidence you're providing. You don't want to just make up an argument that's not based on the evidence. For example, if you're challenging the idea about jobs, you might say, well, it's only created 90% of the jobs it creates are of people who aren't from the region or are external or from other countries. So that jobs argument's not actually valid. But obviously, you can only say that if your evidence, you know, backs that up. So yeah, once you've reverse engineered the argument, you then need to go back and see if this is what you actually wanted to say. But it will give you the bare bones of an advocacy brief. And that's also helpful if your proposal is counterintuitive or challenging, because you have to think hard about how to present it. Because if you're presenting it to someone who has a certain accepted idea about what the status quo is or what reality is, and you're challenging it, you need to work harder and you need to be more convincing. And you probably need to refer back to your evidence more. But as I say, without evidence, policymakers rely on ideology and accepted truths. That's how politicians make decisions. So the evidence you're offering can really help change things. And as I say, it needs to be convincing without exaggerating its significance. Right. I don't think I did slow down, sorry. I'm having problems scrolling down on this. I want to get down to sort of right, so as I said, most briefs can be accommodated in 8 pages, some may be as short as 6. So I'm just going to go into the power of page 1. Many policymakers will only read your first page, I'm afraid. So spend most of your time, or after the planning, this is the most important bit. Spend most of your time getting page 1 right. It should be visually appealing. The writing should be really coherent. And it should present the project's policy relevance in condensed form. So you identify the project, outline the main policy problem it was designed to address, introduce your key findings, advocate a specific course of action. And actually we're going to do, in a bit we're going to do an exercise where we're going to practice doing a bit of what page 1 might look like in terms of your research. But I'll just go through a little bit longer the contents of it. So, I mean, there are some things in here which are, you know, where you put the logo and things like that. Title. Title is really, really important. It needs to capture the essence of your research project, and it needs to be, it can't be really long. It needs to be, you know, again, succinct. You can use, think about using wordplay or metaphor. That's sometimes a nice way, a turn of phrase that is memorable, that will sort of stick in people's mind. Or go for simple and to the point. Don't go for incredibly long and convoluted but describes everything about your project. Don't try and be comprehensive. And also, but equally, don't be so clever with your title that nobody knows what you're talking about. It might be a brilliant pun, but yeah, it may not be the right choice for a policy brief. Save it for the, you know, for another format. I mean, I've given you not particularly exciting examples, but rattling the value chain, work in the age of flexibility is an example of a metaphor. Don't mix your metaphors. That's the other thing that, as an editor, I find very irritating. A metaphor is something that creates an image in your mind. Okay, so you could rattle the value chain because you can rattle a chain, but you can't rattle if you said rattling the value. I'm trying to think of an example now.
Can you explain rattle, please?
Rattle. Oh, it's shaking. So you shake a chain. You know, you can make a noise with a chain. But if you said rattling the wood or rattling the trees, it doesn't make any sense. But you know, people often mix metaphors like that because they're not actually thinking, what does the metaphor mean? So don't do that. Yes.
Questions?
Go for it.
Not recommended, no, as title. Questions, no.
I think questions can work, but I have to say that if you're doing a policy, if you're doing policy recommendations, then you could use maybe a question at the beginning and then your subtitle sounds a bit more right, and we're going to tell you the answer, you know. Yeah, and then
How are you?
good. Small world. I seem to know half the people in here. So, right, and then you need to follow the title with policy implications or findings and recommendations of your project. So just make sure that the introduction, this page 1, is not an academic abstract or a summary as you know it. So you don't need to write procedural details, methodology. You don't need to summarize everything that comes in the brief later. It is an introduction. So its purpose is to succinctly describe the relevant policy problem and relate your evidence to the task of addressing it. And try and keep it to 1 page. Definitely don't go over 2 pages, I would say. But 1.5 pages you get away with. But if you can keep it to 1 page, it'll be great. You can say a lot with few words. One of the other things I would say about writing is a lot of it, a novelist use a phrase which is kill your darlings, which means the most wonderful image or the most interesting idea you came up with or the most brilliant insight that isn't directly related to the narrative you're telling, you have to leave it out. It might be a brilliant observation, but you have to leave it out. And it's really quite a painful process sometimes. But that's a really good piece of advice when you're writing a policy brief. Kill your darlings. Right, so you begin with a paragraph in the introduction which explains the specific policy challenge your research can address. So you want to establish the topic in a policy context straight away. if you're going into an advocacy brief, you may then want to describe the status quo, for example, identify a current problem, which leads you naturally on to suggest another way to approach the situation, but that's not a kind of, that's just one way of doing it. And then you conclude the introduction with a paragraph explaining the main implications of the research findings. So you might want to take sort of the 1 or 2 key recommendations and end with those, sort of be bam, bam. So when a policy reader's only reading the first page, they can go, oh yeah, okay, they're going to tell me something real here that I actually have to do. So I'm going to keep reading then. So on the basis of a short introduction, policymakers should be able to judge whether it's relevant to their discussions and warrants closer scrutiny. It may be as close. I don't want to say it's a marketing project because it isn't marketing, but it is. You are kind of pitching in a way. You know, if you think about when Hollywood commissions movies, you have to be able to pitch your 3-hour-long art house cinema movie in one line to the studio. So there's lots of disciplines where you have to do this, where you have to sort of, you know, condense a huge amount of information into the key point. Yeah.
I have a question.
Yeah.
The ask that you're saying, like, okay, this is the problem, this is what the research shows, and this is what I want you to do about it.
Yeah.
So this ask, or the part that you say, this policy should be changed, how concrete does that need to be? Like, is it really important to say, we recommend changing such and such directive, or can it just be, the European Union should put into place policies to ensure that X, Y, and Z? This is something
I would say, I mean, it depends on the case, but I would say a middle ground is useful. I'll go into that a bit when we talk about a little bit later on with the policy recommendation section. But I think if you say our findings suggest you need to support the welfare state, that's too vague. If you say our policy findings suggest we need to have X amount of hospitals and X amounts of schools within X amount of population, I don't know, just pulling a random example, that gives you a reasonable level of detail, and that then you don't have to go into, and this means you have to change this law, this law, this law, and this law. You know what I mean? So I think being concrete and being positive, there may be a law or policy that's so enormous, for example, you know, a trade treaty that your entire research shows is going to destroy jobs, where you have to say, yes, we recommend, you know, scrapping this. For example, Corporate Europe Observatory last year did a report into the European Trading Initiative, which is the Europeans' carbon markets. And the research basically showed that it wasn't working. So we said, you need to scrap the ETI. So that was very clear, like, right, this policy, you know, needs to go. And then we went into, then the policy recommendations, we went into things that were actually working to reduce carbon. So we were quite specific, but we weren't saying, you know, here in this country, in this project, do this. So I don't know if that explains it enough, but yeah. A good rule of thumb is if what you say can conjure up an image in the mind of the reader, can you imagine, okay, hospitals and schools in this area, that gives you a good level of specificity. If you just say support the welfare state and destroy and avoid environmental degradation and be sustainable, those don't create images in your mind. They just create a sort of vague fuzziness. So yeah, that's a technique that I use as a journalist a lot, and I think that can be a useful tool to think about images. Right, where was I? Okay, so we've done the introduction. Okay, so in terms of timing, we have about 20 minutes left, is that right? Half an hour?
40 minutes.
Oh, 40 minutes, okay, sorry, your clock's a bit... Okay, right, so I'll go on a little bit longer and then we'll do an exercise and put into practice some of these ideas. So if we scroll down to the next page, key observations is the next section. If I can just, I recommend sort of downloading a policy brief, but so this in here, so this is the title, this is the introduction. There's also these are quite important, I think. If you're skim reading something, these sentences on the side give you a sort of, bam, this is what this is about. Right, I'm going to skim down to this bit. This interests me. If someone has, you know, literally under a minute, they can get a sense of what's going on and whether it's worth reading on from these. I don't know what the technical term for these is. The thematic sentence next to the paragraph. Yeah. Okay, so that's the introduction, and then the key observations comes next. So this is where you offer your evidence and your analysis from your research. This is where you. So the introduction is kind of presenting the argument, and this is where you build in logical steps, presenting your evidence. This is where the new knowledge that you offer is put. So you enumerate your most policy relevant findings with basic context. I mean, there are some really obvious points that you use with any kind of writing. So you arrange the material into thematic blocks, which are called paragraphs. And you build an argument systematically. You logically piece together facts and analysis to build a compelling case for your recommendations. So I think that's slightly different to just listing evidence. You know, you're sort of, and here you can use a narrative technique, which, again, writers use, which is sort of because this, and because of that, and because of that. If you kind of think of that, those connecting kind of because, it helps you build a progressing argument that builds. Of course, some of your evidence, you know, will be standalone. Not all of it will flow like that, but that, A, makes it much more readable, much more convincing, and it's quite a good discipline to learn how to do as well. And it applies in all sorts of realms of writing and debate and discussion. Basically, if you can do that, you convince a lot of people of a lot of things. You do it well. Yeah, and I've mentioned already about the thematic summaries in the left margin, opposite the thematic blocks. These are signposts to assist the reader in navigating the brief. Now, there are some sort of tricks and techniques you can use. You can use, very sparingly, you can use graphics or tables to illustrate. I mean, I wouldn't go crazy, but sometimes you can actually convey a lot more. It has to be well done. It's kind of in a sort of data visualization idea. You can convey quite a lot in a very small, you know, graphic that it might take you 3 paragraphs to describe in words. So use it judiciously, but you can do that. And I don't know if you have a policy on photographs, but I think that depends on the organisation.
When you say policy, if we cannot have policy,
yeah. I mean, I think they can be powerful. You have to balance that with the space you have as well. And, you can say a lot in a caption, a surprising amount in a caption as well. And then the other thing that I liked that this policy brief did, which we often do in Corporate Europe Observatory as well, is we can go through sort of really quite dry policy recommendations, and then to bring it back into sort of a real life context, we will use a case study or a detail or an illustrative example in a box. So here we have in focus cooperative water management in Morocco, where you zoom in and go, okay, this is how it matters on the ground, this is how it works on the ground. And those need to be briefed too, but doing that can really just bring the policy back to real life impacts, real life people, real life ecosystems, whatever your subject is. And again, that's the thing about storytelling, that if you can create the image, you know, have someone identify with the story on the ground, you create an emotional connection as well as an intellectual one. And intellectual and emotional kind of reactions together are much more powerful. People might remember the story about Morocco, whereas they might not remember all of the research findings in your briefing, for example. So that's another option as well. Right, and then we go on to policy implications and recommendations. I mean, I guess this is quite small, but you have hopefully most of you have the paper in front of you as well. So policy recommendations, maybe 1 or 2 pages. This is really obvious, but I have seen it happen, so don't do this. Don't offer a recommendation that isn't backed up by your evidence. basically. Like it should follow on, you know, it should be part of the following on your argument. So, so it's because the advice you offer, it derives its authority from the evidence you've provided. And from, you know, the excellence of the research in the previous section. And I would say from a policymaker's perspective, that if you can directly state these recommendations, that has a lot more impact. So you can use words like, you know, adapt the current system to X, Y, Z, or avoid, or create, or develop. So the first word of each recommendation is a kind of action word. It's used. The form of the verb is in the imperative. So it's a recommendation to act. It's an action point. That creates a kind of momentum. And with Leia's question about how specific you can be, I think you need to find a balance between being too vague and being, you know, going into too much detail there. I mean, this is just a policy brief to recommend stuff. If they want to then follow up, that's the point where you can go into more specific details about, okay, how would we apply this on the ground? That's a different stage, I think, that then you go into. Right, and then the bits at the end in terms of format. So the fifth section is the research parameters. So you need to describe your methodology here, your objectives. The methodology description doesn't have to be very long. As I said, it needs to be in there, but it doesn't need to be in great detail. So it should just explain, you know, what you set out to do, the areas you looked at, how you found the information. The methodology could even be just a sentence. So be brief, you know, and you can include further. This briefing includes further reading, and I think that's a nice way of doing it as well. And then the final section is the project identity, which again is sort of self-explanatory, just to sort of identifying funding, time frame, authors, blah blah blah. But one thing I will say there is you can put a website in, and you might, when you're designing your policy brief, you probably want to design one that looks good on a PDF or a page, and then another one which is designed for a website, so that you know. So there's two formats there. So when you're thinking about, I don't think you need to over-design it, but do think about making it attractive, making it clear, making it well-designed, getting kind of, you know, balance right, and think about what it would look on a website as well as just on a PDF or a page. So I think that's increasingly something people do and is useful. And the benefit of sending someone to a website is obviously then you can be like, oh, and to find out more, go here. To find out more, go here. You know. So, are there any questions up to this stage? Because we're going to go into the doing a quick exercise now.
Do you have any example of a policy brief that actually triggered change?
Well, personally, the ones we work on, for example, the one I just said about PR companies lobbying for repressive regimes, there's an MEP group that's just picked it up and is now going to do something about it. But whether the group that I work with is often fighting very, very big corporations. So, you know, it's also about sort of how much, you know, how much political weight, you know, that you can trigger change up to you can make the politicians pick up your argument, but you can't make the politicians win that argument in the political arena, if you see what I mean. So from a personal point of view, yes, I've seen lots of policy briefs that end up getting picked up by politicians and used and actually welcomed. For example, the one that I've just worked on is creating a debate about it. And actually I'm just about to do an interview with Der Spiegel after this class, which also helps because then you get into a media debate, you get into a public debate as well, and you can shift the public terms of the debate a bit that way too. But yeah, the EU has a huge program of funding where it funds kind of research into social sciences and humanities, and has a program and is actually searching for evidence-based briefing. Because if you think about a politician is getting bombarded with lobbyists the whole time, okay, and those lobbyists are all partial. Those lobbyists are from big corporations who want to sell things. They all have a vested interest. an academic coming saying, I studied this for 5 years, I'm looking at this, I'm looking at this, I'm looking really carefully, I'm trying to be objective, and this is our finding, that's going to be welcomed in a way that some lobbyist trying to sell, trying to promote parabens in shampoo is not going to be welcomed. You see what I mean? So I would actually say don't underestimate the power of the power of that evidence and power of your research that can be used. It's a question of opening the door and getting in the door. Yeah. Yeah. Sorry, go on, yes.
Would you say there would be any difference in what you recommended if we're writing a policy brief for, let's say, the European Union or a national government or extra-European context?
I mean, I think most of what I said is quite universally applicable. There might be, I mean, I would check the policy brief criteria. There might be that national governments want a different format, or slightly different format of a policy briefing, but it would be very technical, I think, like how many pages, or whether you call it key observations or whether you call it evidence, or whether, but I wouldn't actually say that there's a huge amount of difference. I mean, you have to tailor the content of your recommendations, obviously, based on who they are. But I think, the big picture kind of ideas that I've talked about here, I think they're all pretty applicable. So, are there any other questions for now? You're ready to try and write one in 20 minutes. If you can summarise your entire PhD in 3 sentences, that would be great. No, I'm not going to ask you to do that. I'm going to ask you, I don't know if everyone has something that they can write with, and I'm also going to get you into pairs, okay? And what I'd like you to do, well, before you get into pairs, I'd like you to write a proposed title. This is just a first draft. Hemingway said all first drafts are terrible, so don't get panicky about it, because the point about first drafts is you go back and you revise them and you make them better. So don't get worried about how good it is. Just think about what a title would be for a policy brief that you would write based on your research, and what are 3 key points you would put in the introduction. Like, if, say, your introduction was 3 paragraphs long, what are 3 key observations and recommendations you would put in? And if you take 10 minutes to do that, and then we're going to get your partner to read yours and you to read your partner's. And then without referring back to the page, we want them to reflect what they understood from what you said. And that can be useful as well. Just thinking about 3 sentences is kind of useful in condensing down an idea and an information. And then getting someone to reflect back to you, this is also a useful thing when you're writing a policy brief, because what you understand that you think you've made obvious may not be obvious to the other person. Now, you may all be in the similar fields, so you may have less of that kind of, less lack of background information, but I think it's a useful exercise to try. So, yes.
How can we organize this in terms of time? So that perhaps we can have a discussion as well in case people want to ask something or say something about their experience. Of
yeah.
So we take 5 minutes to write the 3 key points and then 5 to 10 minutes to explain.
Yes, and then sorry, the clock on here says 10:22, so I'm a bit lost. It's 5:02. Yeah.
So we have half an hour.
So we have half an hour. Okay, so I would say 10 minutes to write, 10 minutes to discuss, or 5 minutes to discuss.
5 minutes to write and
5
minutes to discuss.
Okay, 5.
No, I'm just proposing. I don't know.
Yeah, yeah. I think you need more time to write the sentences, and then you don't need to go into a really long discussion. You need to just be like, this is what I understood, and you have to not refer. Absolutely, don't cheat. Don't refer back to the page. You have to say, this is what I understood. So 10 minutes to write it, and then get into pairs and swap it with the next person. And then I would say 5 minutes for each person to discuss. And then we'll go back into group and see what you found. Okay?
And 3 key findings or recommendations?
No, I would say 3 points that you would put in the introduction. So this is, we were talking about how important the introduction is in kind of summarising, in introducing the subject. So you want to end with, you probably want to have 1 key recommendation in there. You want to have like, what's the problem? What are my findings? What's the recommendation? As an introductory paragraph. But it could be 3, whatever, it doesn't have to be the whole thing. This is just a beginning stage, right? So you don't have to have it fully formed right now. And you've only got 10 minutes, so do the 3 points you can come up with.
And we leave the categories as they are.
Okay, so we're gonna share now some of the things that you've learned from this exercise in a bigger group. Hello.
Hello. Hello, everybody.
Right, even if you haven't finished, we're running out of time now, so we're just going to bring back some of what we discovered into a bigger group for a 10-minute discussion at the end. So think about what worked, what communicated well, what didn't work, what did people miss, what can be improved, so those kinds of ideas. And if you can, if anyone, I don't know if anyone has, can share how that experience was with their own, with doing their own one, or with reflecting back on someone else.
I think we've been very good.
Excellent. My job is done.
No, you know why? Because all the three of us, like, first identified something that is lacking in the regulation.
Yeah.
Secondly, present evidence that this is bad.
Yeah.
And third, we recommend how to change this bad situation.
Yeah.
Even at the three completely different cases. But
yeah.
this was the progression in all the three cases.
Ah, excellent. Yeah. So you're on the way then.
Okay.
Bravo.
Bravo.
And it doesn't all set out.
I think the difficult thing is to formulate it in a language that is not difficult to read. When
yeah.
you read it out loud, you realize that we are used to writing 3-line sentences.
Absolutely.
And God is tough to read it.
Yes. That is a very good tip. Read it out loud.
Yes.
I often do that with my own work, and you find all sorts of errors and mistakes that you didn't realise, or get someone else to read it for you, and also get feedback from someone who is, whose opinion you trust, who isn't in your field. Get, external feedback. Yeah.
Yeah, this is also an issue, no? Because if I am doing, for example, in my case, I am doing a policy brief that is on waste management.
Yeah.
So necessarily, I could go into some detail in terms of, what different kind of waste, different kind of recycling scheme or practices. So it will be oriented to some policymakers that are already prepared to think about waste management issues.
Yeah.
Should I reason like this, or should I even make it language even more simple, to boil it down really for any kind of policymaker?
It depends who the audience is. If you know that this is just going to sort of a select committee on waste management, you can tailor your language to, they will know some of the issues you're discussing, or if you're just bringing it to a general audience. So it completely depends on, on who your audience is. Or you could write a general one and then tailor it if you know that you're bringing it to one group who is more specifically an expert in that area. So, yeah, I'm afraid I don't have a key answer on that. It depends on the audience. But the audience is what you use to frame your policy brief. Think about your audience first and then frame it. Does anyone else have any feedback? Yeah.
I think I realized I could say something about the result. I structure it as, what motivates my research, the 3 points, what was the key finding, and what would be a key recommendation.
Mm-hmm.
And I found probably it made more sense to find out what was my key finding, what motivated my research was not very clear, and I didn't have a lot of time to do the other one.
Yeah.
And I'm saying that, and I think it's probably useful because it reflects not only the state of confusion that I have with my research, but also the fact that the way I do research is a little bit more grounded, like in the sense that I had an initial objective, I went to the ground, to the field, and found something different.
Yeah.
So I need now to reformulate what motivates my research.
Yeah.
Which is it's not only challenging, but it's also, I think, common with lots of us. We go for something and we find something else. So then you have to justify it somehow differently, and then we think of the recommendations.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure how you get along this.
I think for a policy brief, you don't need to describe that journey you went on of starting out looking at this, and I think
that's why.
Yeah. But I think just doing a very simple exercise like this is really useful because it also, as you say, it can actually focus your mind on, oh, hang on, I have had two conflicting objectives in my research, and which one am I actually going to focus on in terms of, you know, in general. So I think it can be just a useful thought experiment in general. But yeah, I think that for a policy brief term, for an introduction, you might say, okay, I found this. So what you're saying is you found a new situation. So you would take that new situation and describe that. This is the scenario, and then these are my findings, and then these are my recommendations. And you've got a whole backstory there, but you don't necessarily need to bring all of that to the, yeah.
No, I just wanted to add on that reading Christos, and also I tended to do that as well. Instead of writing what the problem is, more or less, writing it in a sense like, what was my research question somehow?
Yeah.
Which can be very different.
Yeah.
Because you start from a it's like the problem might be the entry point.
Yeah.
And your research questions might end up to be something else.
Yeah.
Like, so for example, I was looking at disease, my research question in the end ended up being about the state, but I'm not going to say that the problem is the state here, because I'm writing to the state, right? So I have to go back a step and like see where the problem or my problem was.
Yeah.
I don't know if that is helpful to me.
Yeah, no, I think that's really useful. It's a question of framing and slightly shifting the frame and choosing how you then construct what you're describing to people. And this is sort of a slightly brutal thing, I think, is that, you know, if you spent years doing something, you know, you have all this sort of, oh, this is my research question, this is what I cared about, and then this changed. They don't the publishers don't care about that. They're not interested in you. That, you know, they're interested in your findings. And so it's it's the sort of, as you say, instead of focusing on the research question, focusing on the problem and then what you might recommend in order to, And there are other forums and other places where, you know, the discussion about what your research question is will come up, but this isn't the forum for it. So Leia.
What my question is that let's say your policy recommendation or what you want to get across is kind of so radical that you know that the government would never institute that policy. You know, you're like, oh, let's go for a degrowth economy, or let's recognize indigenous sovereignty, or something like that. Is there any point to make a policy brief about something like that?
Can I say something related to that?
Yeah, go. Sure.
I found myself writing like some rather conservative policy recommendations, even though I want something a lot more radical. And I'm wondering whether it's the format and this idea that now I'm writing a policy paper that made me do this. You know?
That's what policy.
I have a feeling that once you break down
blame the format.
Your point and then put in a language that policymakers can understand, then I looked at it and I said, fucking writing like the World Bank.
Yeah. No, this is really interesting. I mean, I think there is something about formats that push you into a certain attitude, and I think that you can pull back from that as well, and it's good to be conscious of that. But for example, I think to go back to Leia's question, I mean, I think it depends on who you're talking to. If you're talking to people who, if you think there might be a possibility of them being like, yes, let's recognise indigenous sovereignty, just go for it. But if they're just going to throw that in the bin, and this is a question you have to ask. Everyone has to ask themselves, and everyone has to sort of negotiate with their ethics and how true to what their evidence they are. And you have to think about the audience and how you say it. But there is one thing I will say, which is there's a saying which, if you're going to say something radical, dress as conservatively as possible. And you can also say that in a policy brief, where you can actually slip in some really radical stuff, and you don't, but use language that's not like, we're calling for a global revolution. We are a degrowth revolution. We're saying, the neoliberal model has fissures, and we suggest, that they can be, there's ways to finesse it where you can still be radical and say what you believe, but you can frame it in a way, that doesn't scare people off. So.
But sorry about the audiences. I think sometimes, because when we did that brief for people, the one you had there, I think sometimes what can help you a little bit out of that conundrum is that think that the audience is not necessarily the policy makers, but what we call, policy stakeholders. I know we don't like the word. In what sense? In the sense that someone else can pick up this policy brief. Was it, as you said, a party, leading party that wants to contest policy in that area. So think of your audience as the policy stakeholders, which can be an NGO as well, or which can be an observatory or anything. When you're writing the brief, and this I think helps you move a little bit outside this conservative language and focus, because you think, well,
but that's a big shift. That's a big difference you were talking about. If my audience is an NGO or my audience is a guy sitting in the European Parliament or in the Italian Parliament.
But that's the challenge. No, but that's the challenge. The challenge is for you to use that language that can be read by both them and the other ones.
I mean, that's what we do in Corporate Europe Observatory. I just wrote a briefing that is used for MEPs and for campaigners. And it was hard, but you can do it.
But many times we work with the NGOs or with movements who are already are so immersed in the community that they write policy briefs with the community, and they are so technical and so radical in the same time. We don't even think, maybe as researchers, we don't have the imagination that they have on the ground, because they live there every day, and they don't go back to stay like this and look at the community the way researchers do. Actually, they come with very strategized ways of looking at the issue. So what they ask themselves, what can we do to survive and to reproduce ourselves in the community? So they bring us the recommendations already.
I think that's a really good point.
We have to be honest and push them further through other mechanisms.
I mean, I think also one thing you can say there is a lot of those movements have brilliant ideas but aren't able to communicate them outside their own campaigning forum, for example, the language they use. So so one thing is radical listening and participatory listening of recommendations that aren't actually coming from you, they're actually coming from the grassroots. And then maybe how can you be a bridge to make those to make those recommendations heard and make them framed in a language that can be translatable. So that's something I've struggled with for many years of writing about social movements and working with social movements as a journalist as well. So it's an interesting question. Has anyone else got? Oh, we're kind of at time, I think, in terms of needing to get to the lecture theatre for the next. The Time Guardian. Okay. Well, thank you very much. It was a really interesting discussion.